Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Today, we're going to talk about ODM DirSync, talk about best practices associated with getting the products installed, getting it configured, but more so about making sure that the implementation is going to be successful for your particular project. If we talk a little bit about what is ODM DirSync, ODM DirSync is a tool that can do a lot of things. The directory synchronization can go from on-prem AD to on-prem AD to Azure to tenant to tenant to tenant to on-prem. Lots and lots of different things that it can do. And the challenge there is that with all of that functionality comes complexity. And so what we're going to talk today a little bit about is how to address some of that complexity, how to understand what needs to be addressed when you start getting into the setup and configuration of the directory synchronization pieces of it. And so let's talk about what some of those complexities are. The biggest thing, the number one thing, is to make sure to understand that everything's connected. So if you're doing a simple AD to AD directory synchronization, understand that there's a lot of things that connect into those AD accounts and how those AD accounts are going to work after the directory synchronization is going to be really important. Not to mention dealing with Azure AD Connect and tenants, and how in a lot of migrations we have situations where the AD objects are being synced up to a tenant. And really the biggest thing, right, is to understand how all of those things are connected prior to starting, what you have in those environments that are going to need to be accounted for when you start doing the directory synchronization. Another thing, what attributes, right? Simple stuff. Do we bring everything over? Do we need to bring everything over? Do we need to take data that exists in the source environment and put it somewhere else in the target, right? Do we need to take the address field that exists in the source AD object, but put it into extension attribute 10 in the target? Things like that are really, really important to have a good understanding really before you even begin, right, to do the directory synchronization. So get an idea, get a map of all the attributes that exist in the source. Do they have schema extensions? Do you need to bring over those extensions? If you do, where are you going to put the data? Are you going to extend the schema in the target as well to accommodate for those as you move that data over? Obviously, security implications are huge. Making sure you understand what we're bringing over and how it's going to impact any type of security systems that you have in that target environment. And then obviously applications, right? How do applications interact with the AD accounts? Making sure to have, again, that plan, right? Understand what needs to be done before you actually start doing it really will save a lot of time, a lot of headache when you start doing the implementation. So prereqs, this is a big one. Probably 90% of the calls that we get from customers and partners related to DirSync and having issues with DirSync are related to the prereqs not being in place. Okay, so while it seems very simple and very straightforward, there's a lot of things that have to be done in order to make sure that things work. And the important part is kind of that next bullet, right, where it says 100% of the prereqs must be in place for the tool to function properly. Absolutely true. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the specifics later on in the discussion here. But again, it's really, really important, right, to make sure that all of those prereqs are in place. Obviously, account permissions, making sure we have the permissions to do what we need to do. Little things like making sure IPv6 is turned on the servers that are running the DirSync agents for on-prem directory synchronization. MFA can't be enabled. Antivirus exclusions are probably 70% of the calls, right? That the exclusions aren't in place and that are preventing us from doing the synchronization or reading password hashes and things like that. So again, really, really simple stuff, and it's all included within the documentation, but it's really important to make sure you understand that if you haven't gone through that list and haven't done a comprehensive validation that all of those prereqs are in place, you're probably going to run into problems. Okay. Passwords, right? We talked about exclusions, right? The BT Pass folder, the BT PA exec app, right? Those are the things that are doing the password hash writing and reading. They need to be excluded. Another thing that's really important to understand is having access to the $admin share on the DC that we're pulling the passwords from, or PBC if we're going to do SID history synchronization. Can you go into the machine that's running the DirSync agent and go to that $admin share on the DC that we've selected and connect in and see the contents, right? Again, audit logging, all of the things that are covered in the requirements doc, but are so critical to make sure that they're in place, because again, it won't work. A couple things that are important from a tool configuration, a product configuration perspective, is making sure you understand that while we have separated out the password synchronization component of ODM DirSync, understand that the way we do password synchronizations is still based on the matching that has to happen within the DirSync workflow, okay? So without the matching in place, we're not going to be able to do password synchronization. So you have to get a workflow created that has at least, right, a read from and a match job in it so that we can sync the passwords. Okay. Another thing that's important to understand is that we can have up to 5 agents per source domain. So in most cases, if you're migrating less than, a couple thousand objects, one's probably going to be fine. But also understand that we can have more. So when you get into larger environments, or you get into situations where you have DC replication issues, or you need to separate out the password synchronization component from the actual attribute synchronization, you can create more. You can create more agents if you need to. And then again, things like bidirectional password synchronization, really, really simple and straightforward in the tool. If you wanted to only do bidirectional password synchronization, right? You didn't care about any attributes or anything like that. All you have to do is create the workflow or the template that includes the Unicode password field, and you're off and running. Right? So again, really simple, really easy to do bidirectional password synchronization, but just make sure that when you create that template and that workflow, right, that you only have that field in there so that we're not syncing other attributes. Okay. SID history, again, pretty straightforward. We don't need a trust to sync SID history. Obviously, it doesn't do you much good without the trust, but oftentimes what we see with customers is that they'll bring over the SID history without the trust, knowing that down the road they're going to turn SID history on, or turn the trust on. So this is like for initial implementation, setup, and configuration. We want to get the values over there, and that once we start doing the production migrations, then we can turn that trust on. So again, we don't care, doesn't need to have a trust. Obviously, down the road, if you intend to use it for what most people use the SID history value for, trust can definitely help. Again, little things, right? This is, again, all covered in the requirements doc, but the $, groups, right? The domain name $, they got to be empty. It can't have anybody in it. doesn't work if there's somebody inside that group. Is it a domain local group? Guess what? It won't work if it's a universal group or any other type of group, right? SID filtering, audit properties, again, these are all things that are critical, right, to making sure that SID history synchronization works. Without all of these things in place, if you click that little checkbox that says, sync SID history, it isn't going to work. You're going to get an error saying I can't. Okay. So again, the point being here is it's so important to go over these things ahead of time. Make sure these things are all in place. Validate that they're all in place before you do your initial setup and configuration. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress here. But again, another thing to consider too is what are the security ramifications of doing SID history synchronization? There's a lot of attacks recently that look at SIDs and try to hijack SIDs, right? Do you really need to bring SID history over? It's not required, right? So again, consider what the ramifications are to your environment by bringing the SID history value over. Looking at what exists in the SID history value today in that source object. Does that object have SID history values in it? Do you need to bring them over? Probably not, right? So again, you can strip out old SID history data from that source object and not sync it over to the target, but that just writing the source SID value in the SID history field in the target, so that there's only one SID history entry in there. So again, take a close look, understand what you have in that source environment, what you want to do with it, and how you want to deal with it moving forward. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some setup and configuration tips. The biggest tip I can give you, the number one tip, is to be patient. I know it sounds silly, but it's important. Remember that ODM DirSync is a SaaS application. And remember that it's the agents calling on a regular basis to ask for jobs. So when you click a button, don't expect something to happen immediately. You have to wait for the timers to kick in to push the job to it. Okay. Obviously, password's a little bit different, right? We've got the 60-second password timer, but for AD attribute synchronization, right, that's on 15-minute timers. Okay. So again, be patient. Don't expect everything to happen all at once when you click that button. Okay. Add your environments, make sure the agents are up and running. Again, pretty basic stuff. But what's important is that when you first do your setup and configuration, be very specific about what the scope is of what you're looking at. Don't read in your entire source environment. Don't read in your entire target environment. There's no reason to when you're setting up the tool. My suggestion, create some test OUs in the source, create a test OU in the target that we're going to put the objects in, and limit that workflow to only read those test OUs. Okay? Create the workflow that only reads those OUs. Because what that buys you is it allows you to look at what we're reading in, right? So you can actually go into the tool then and look at the content that we picked up based on your criteria, okay? We're just doing a read. We just want to make sure that we're able to pull data in, okay? And do not match, right? Do not match that initially because, again, there's issues associated with doing matching ahead of time before you get your matching criteria defined, okay? So again, just create a workflow that does a read, nothing else. Also understand schema extensions, right? You have to add schema extensions through an import file. What extensions do you have? What extensions do you need to bring over? Every customer is kind of different. But again, just understand that we can address them. We can bring in those schema extensions, but we just need to know what they are. Okay. And then minor thing. Remember, if you happen to be doing a tenant to on-prem directory sync, just remember that the attributes, some of the attributes in the tenant object or the Azure object are a little bit different than the local AD objects. Okay. When you do your initial testing, okay, when you start building up your workflows, we typically recommend that you set up at least two workflows, one for users and one for groups. And the reason we do that is so that we don't try to add users to groups that may not have already been synced over yet. Okay, it's important when you get into production so you don't have to deal with a whole bunch of ugly log files. So run the workflow that has the users first, then run the workflow that does the groups. Okay, matching is sticky, right? We talked a little bit about this earlier. Really important to understand what your matching criteria is. If you've already pre-created or you've got Workday or some other HR system that has to own the creation of the objects in the target, you're matching on those and you're updating attributes, make sure that your matching criteria is 100%. 80%, 90%, that's bad. That means 10% of the objects, right, are going to get overwritten with different attributes from a different object in the source environment. You do not want that. So again, you can use the test mode, but work really hard to make sure, right, that you have a good set of matching criteria in order to do this. Sometimes it requires you to go in and update an attribute in the source object to match something in the target, just to make sure. Okay, but just understand that matching is really, really important to get right from the start. Okay, obviously overrides. This is where we talk about data manipulation and things like that. Test them, test, and make sure to test some more. Right. We've got examples and things like that, but overrides can be very complicated. They can do a lot of different things. So again, we always tell you to test and validate them before you actually start running against production users. And then once you get everything tested, once everything's validated, once everything's configured, then start slowly adding production users, production groups into the workflows. Make sure everything works. Make sure everything's looking as you expect it in the target environment before you just dump in the entire contents of that source environment. Okay. Lastly, we talk about production deployment. Again, start slow, build scope. You don't have to do everything the first hour you install the tool. You don't have to do everything. You don't want to. Because again, you can do some pretty scary things, right? If your matching criteria is not set, right? You can overwrite production users in the target environment that you don't want to. Always take a close look at the log files when you start adding scope into your workflows. Make sure everything's looking proper. Make sure everything's looking right. Okay. Again, that be patient part, really, really important to understand that. Take a deep breath, right? Click go and understand that it's going to take 10, 15 minutes sometimes for the jobs to get picked up, right, to perform the actions. The other thing, and the last thing here I really want to bring up with you is make sure that during this entire process of deploying ODM DirSync, right, that you're working with application owners. Make sure that you start that process as early in the project as you can, so that way, when you start moving users over, right, you can also have started the application migration and getting those applications that are needed from that source environment into the target environment. Okay? Because again, you know, all applications do different things, and it'd be really impossible to come up with a programmatic method for moving all applications and looking at config files, and you know, if anybody hard coded addresses in, or you know, AD object names, you know, those things all have to be addressed, and generally it's addressed by hand. So start that process early on, and again, will help decrease the amount of time you spend on your project.